The air near the celestial apparatus smelled of ozone, burnt ash, and desperation. Wilson Percival Higgsbury, scientist, gentleman, and increasingly manic survivor, adjusted the welding mask fashioned from tattered remnants of a top hat and tinted glass. The machine before him was an atrocity of logic, a rickety fusion of gears salvaged from Clockwork Nights, obsidian from the ruins of the volcanic biome, and an immense conical chassis woven from reinforced reeds in a lattice of nightmare fuel. He called it the Lunarum Launchpad. For 600 days, Wilson had endured the constant. He had mapped its biomes, survived its seasons, and stared down the shadowy horrors that stalked the twilight. Yet, a deep, persistent hum emanating from the sky, an anomaly the local pigs and spiders ignored, had driven him to this ultimate, irrational endeavor. The hum, he now knew, was the moon. And it was beckoning. In the glow of the final assembly, his sanity meter flickered into the red. The shadows around him began to coalesce, whispering promises of easy oblivion. Nonsense, Wilson muttered, tightening the last bolt, a twisted chunk of thulecite. Logic dictates that the ultimate source of all this mess must be investigated. And perhaps, exploited. He secured his minimal supplies. A thermal stone, a stack of cooked monster meat, a freshly sharpened spear, and the blueprints for the return journey, scrawled furiously on the back of a map of the swamp. At the apex of the machine, Wilson climbed into the cramped control dome. He flipped the central switch, carved from a petrified tree. The launchpad roared to life, not with the clean burn of gasoline, but with the tortured energy of captured lightning and a contained core of pure, shimmering nightmare fuel. The ascent was not smooth. It was a chaotic, sickening blur of acceleration. The world below, the safety of the constant's absurd, cruel familiarity, shrank into a tiny, brown and orange marble. Then, nothing but the icy, echoing void. G-forces pinned him, his breath hitched, and his mind, relieved of the localized reality of the constant, flooded with cosmic dread. Wilson felt his sanity drop steeply, not because of monsters, but because of the sheer, terrifying emptiness of space. Then, with a shudder that threatened to disassemble his delicate contraption, the Lunarum launchpad slammed down. The impact was cushioned, surprisingly, by a deep drift of fine, pearlescent dust. Wilson stumbled out of the wreckage, coughing. The moon was not the silent, pristine satellite of childhood lore. It was a raw, geological wound. The sky was a canvas of deep violet, perpetually bruised by distant, crackling electrical storms. The ground beneath his feet was treacherous, comprised of crystalline shards and pits that glowed with sickly internal light. And the fundamental reality of this place was sickeningly organic. The moon was alive. Every few minutes, a low, resonant thrum vibrated through the crust. During these pulses, the ground visibly swelled, miniature canyons opened and closed like gaping mouths, and geysers of incandescent, pressurized dust erupted into the low-gravity atmosphere. Wilson checked his remaining supplies. His hunger was manageable, his health decent, but his sanity was plummeting faster than ever before. The ambient noise, a constant, high-pitched keening that sounded like millions of tiny, mournful insects, was unbearable. He needed to survive, and he needed to build the constant anchor, his return machine. The materials required were alien and dangerous. Selenite ore, found only deep within the pulsating craters. Void filament, harvested from the moon's unique flora. Living regolith, the highly pressurized, pulsing dust, which served as the moon's volatile power source. Wilson set his backpack down beside a jagged outcrop of strange, black rock, the only spot that felt remotely stable, and began his gruesome work. The first few days were a desperate scramble. The low gravity was initially exhilarating, allowing massive leaps across chasms, but it quickly became an enemy. Momentum was hard to control, and misjudging a landing meant tumbling hundreds of feet. The local wildlife was immediately hostile. The cinder moas were the first threat. They resembled gaunt, six-legged birds whose bodies were composed of smoldering magma and cooling ash. They didn't attack physically, they spat balls of superheated selenite ore that cooled instantly upon impact, pinning Wilson to the ground. He learned quickly that his thermal stone, usually a comfort, became a liability, supercharging the moa's projectiles. He used the cover of a major pulse event, where the ground temporarily warped, disorienting the creatures, to gather his first batch of selenite ore. It felt like harvesting teeth from a giant, shivering beast. The most insidious creatures were the void weavers. Delicate, ethereal spiders that floated on the wind currents, they were only visible when they shimmered with captured moonlight. They lowered themselves silently on nearly invisible strands of void filament, injecting a toxin that induced immediate, terrifying hallucinations. One evening, while trying to pry a glowing bloom of void filament from a cliff face, a weaver landed on his shoulder. Wilson staggered back, tearing it off, but the toxin was already working. The world fractured. The shadow figures from the constant, usually confined to the edges of his vision, grew solid here, taking the shape of distorted, grinning Wilson doppelgangers. They mimicked his movements, offering mocking commentary on his foolishness. "You built this cage yourself, Wilson," hissed a shadow self in his ear. And the moon doesn't want you to leave. It needs you. Wilson forced himself to focus, jamming a handful of cooked moa leg into his mouth. The simple act of eating grounded him, arresting the worst of the psychological assault. He managed to secure the bundle of filament, feeling its strange, electrical charge against his skin. Gathering the living regolith proved to be the climax of his resource hunt. The regolith was the moon's circulatory system, contained within immense, pressurized sacs that only breached during the largest geological pulses, the moon breaths. Wilson tracked a massive, pulsing crater, easily 100 feet across, to the edge of a jagged plateau. He calculated the next major moon breath was imminent. He needed to be in the crater floor when it ruptured, siphon the pressurized dust, and escape before the crust sealed itself shut again. Waiting on the crater rim, the temperature dropped to lethal cold. The air thickened with a sound like grinding tectonic plates. Thurum, the ground convulsed. Wilson jumped, using the low gravity to float down to the churning floor. The center of the crater cracked open with a blinding flash, releasing a torrent of glowing, semi-liquid dust that reeked of iron and static electricity. He plunged the funnel of his custom-built siphon deep into the eruption. The living regolith screamed, a sound so loud and profoundly alien that Wilson's sanity meter dropped to 0. He was overwhelmed by visions, not of shadow creatures, but of the moon's consciousness. It was vast, ancient, and profoundly lonely. It saw him not as an intruder, but as a temporary, fascinating parasite. It didn't hate him, it simply intended to absorb him. The ground was stabilizing, the fissure was closing, slowly, irrevocably. Wilson yanked the siphon free, the container now vibrating violently with trapped regolith. He had minutes. As he scrambled for purchase, the moon deployed its final defense, a lumbering, mountainous entity that rose from the crater wall, the regolith guardian. It was a massive, shifting amalgamation of selenite plates and pressurized dust, moving with the sluggish inevitability of a glacier. The guardian extended a colossal, crystalline limb towards Wilson. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Wilson used the low gravity to his advantage. He launched himself over the closing fissure, the heat of the ceiling crust scorching his boots. The guardian's grip missed him by inches, smashing the plateau where he had been standing. He landed hard, far from the crater, the canister of regolith vibrating like a trapped heart. Wilson worked for 36 hours straight, fueled by desperation and a dwindling supply of stale jerky. He assembled the constant anchor. It was smaller and more streamlined than the Lunarum launchpad, designed not for raw power, but for precision. Its core was the volatile living regolith, shielded by the reflective selenite, and structurally reinforced by the bizarre, electrically charged void filaments. As he bolted the final piece of thulecite into the chassis, the moon seemed to notice. The ambient throbbing intensified. Electrical discharges arced from the jagged peaks, striking the ground nearby. The cinder moas began to aggregate on the horizon, their smoldering bodies creating a wall of heat. It was time. Wilson climbed into the cockpit, placing his few remaining supplies beside him. The moon was fighting back, actively trying to shake the ground beneath the anchor. He engaged the power, a massive release of the volatile living regolith. The machine surged, humming a desperate, high-pitched tune. The cinder moas were closing in. The regolith guardian was beginning to shift again, its mountainous form gaining momentum. Wilson flipped the launch switch. The constant anchor didn't roar, it snapped. It was a clean, blinding flash of escape velocity. The forces were greater this time. Wilson blacked out momentarily, the entire world reduced to a violent, high-frequency vibration. He saw the moon shrink below him, a frantic, swirling vortex of purple light and grasping shadows. He was back in the echoing void. Time ceased to function. How long was he traveling? Days. Seconds. His sanity was still 0, but the moon's keening was replaced by the familiar, mocking laughter of the constant shadows. He was going home. The return was abrupt. There was no gentle re-entry, only a sudden, violent deceleration as the anchor's rudimentary atmospheric brakes engaged. The machine slammed into the ground of the forest biome, burying itself halfway into the damp earth beside Wilson's abandoned base camp. Wilson stumbled out, weak and shaking, his eyes blinking against the familiar, sickly orange glow of a constant dusk. The air was heavy, smelling of pine, mud, and desperation. He heard the comforting, low grunts of nearby pigmen and the chittering of spiders preparing for the night hunt. His sanity immediately stabilized, soaring rapidly away from 0, not because the place was safe, but because it was known. He looked over his shoulder. The wreckage of the constant anchor steamed gently. It was broken beyond repair, but it had worked. He turned his gaze skyward. The moon hung there, a massive, impossible silver disk. Now, Wilson knew its secret. He knew its pulse. He knew its emptiness. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that the door was still open. He walked slowly towards the flickering warmth of his fire pit. He was exhausted, still covered in alien dust, and profoundly alone. He had survived the ultimate journey, only to return to the ultimate prison. Wilson sat down, pulled a morsel of dried meat from his pocket, and stared into the flames. He was free of the moon, but he was still trapped in the constant. And now, he knew there were things far more volatile and alive than the constant itself, waiting patiently just beyond the reach of the stars. The next experiment would need to be bigger. He needed to find a way not just to escape the world, but to escape the whole reality. Wilson sighed, adjusted his tattered coat, and began to sketch new blueprints for the next, inevitable, insane venture. Survival was boring. Conquest was far more interesting.